At the most sacred moment of Pope Francis's funeral, when the world bowed in mourning, one lone figure dared to break a tradition older than memory itself. Amid the sea of rigid discipline and solemn ritual, a single Swiss guard, standing tall in his crimson and blue uniform, moved in a way no one expected. Before millions watching across the world, he defied the ancient code of silence and stillness that had defined his service. His action stunned the cardinals gathered around the coffin, froze the mourners in their seats, and left the entire Vatican in breathless silence. Whispers rippled through the great halls of St. Peter's Basilica as a sacred protocol, unbroken for centuries, was shattered before their eyes. But as stunned eyes turned toward the guard, and judgment began to form on trembling lips, none could have foreseen what would happen next, because when the truth behind his defiance emerged, everything changed. Before we reveal what truly happened that day, before we uncover the reason why a single act of defiance would echo through the Vatican's ancient halls, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And stay with us, because this story is one the Vatican will never forget. Corporal Luca Bernardi had always believed that service was more than duty. It was devotion. Born in a quiet village tucked between the emerald hills of Lucerne, he grew up beneath the steeples of ancient stone churches, where bells sang at dawn and prayer framed every part of life. His family had been farmers for generations, humble in means but rich in faith. From the time he could walk, Luca's small hand clutched his grandfather's as they knelt together in the old wooden pews, his grandfather's whispered prayers weaving into the boy's heart like sacred threads. It was his grandfather, stern but kind, a man whose back had bent under years of honest work, who first spoke to him of the Swiss Guard, calling it the highest honor a Catholic man could aspire to. Luca never forgot those stories, of swords held not for glory but for service, of loyalty offered not to power but to a greater good. At 17, Luca had left his village behind, carrying with him nothing but a worn Bible, his grandfather's old St. Christopher medal, and a heart burning with purpose. After years of unrelenting discipline and sacrifice, he had earned his place among the Vatican's elite protectors, his crisp uniform and upright posture, a living testament to the vows he had made as a boy. For 10 years, he had stood watch at some of the most sacred events in Catholic history, never flinching, never failing. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the loss that would shake his foundation just weeks before the world said goodbye to Pope Francis. His grandfather, the man who had taught him to pray, to serve, to believe, passed away quietly in the same stone house where Luca had once dreamed of greatness. As the world mourned a pope, Luca mourned a grandfather, and though duty called him to stand silent among thousands that day, something deeper stirred within him, something that would soon test the very limits of everything he had ever been taught about loyalty, tradition, and the true meaning of honor. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy, ash-gray clouds gathered above Vatican City, as if the heavens themselves mourned alongside the faithful. St. Peter's Basilica stood draped in silence, its grand marble columns wrapped in solemnity rather than splendor. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the weight of history, every stone seeming to absorb the sorrow of the moment. Black-robed cardinals moved like shadows beneath the soaring vaulted ceilings, their faces drawn and somber. Heads of state from every corner of the world sat in hushed reverence, their ceremonial sashes muted beneath their mourning attire. Along the central nave, rows of dignitaries lined the ancient pews, their gazes locked onto the simple white coffin resting before the high altar, a man of extraordinary humility, receiving a farewell bathed in grandeur. Golden rays filtered through the towering stained glass, slicing the gloom with shafts of ethereal light that danced upon the marble floor. Solemn hymns floated through the air, carried on the slow, reverent rise and fall of the Sistine choir's voices, each note a lament for a world suddenly lonelier without its shepherd. Candles flickered in trembling rows, their tiny flames fighting against the cavernous darkness that pressed in from all sides. And through it all, the Swiss guards stood unmoving, sentinels of ancient tradition and living statues of loyalty, their pikes held high, faces set in unbreakable stoicism. They formed an unbroken ring around the heart of the ceremony. Not a twitch, not a breath out of rhythm, their discipline a silent tribute to the man they had sworn to protect in life, and now in death. Corporal Luca Bernardi stood among them, his mind a battleground between the ironclad discipline that had shaped him for a decade and the storm of grief that battered at the walls he had so carefully built. His gloved hand gripped the pike shaft tighter, the St. Christopher medal hidden beneath his armor pressing cold against his chest, a small, aching reminder of the promise he once made to serve with all his heart. But today, the line between duty and love would blur, and in a few moments, a tradition that had endured for centuries would falter. The funeral reached its most sacred moment, the final blessing, the moment when the Pope's soul was formally commended to the mercy of God, had begun. A hush fell over the thousands gathered inside St. Peter's Basilica, so deep it seemed the great stone pillars themselves held their breath. The Swiss guards remained statuesque, their pikes gleaming in the golden light, their faces impassive, their discipline unbreakable. Rows of cardinals knelt in deep prayer, the heads of nations bowed low, the choir's voices swelled and then dipped into a reverent silence as the prayers of farewell filled the ancient space. Corporal Luca Bernardi's eyes remained locked forward, his stance perfect, his breathing slow and controlled. Yet somewhere within him, grief gnawed relentlessly at the dam he had built around his heart. In his mind's eye he saw not the solemn grandeur before him, but a simpler memory. His grandfather's weathered hands lighting a candle in the little church of Lucerne, whispering prayers for a dying pope decades earlier. A shepherd deserves to be mourned by his flock, his grandfather had once said. The words echoed now, louder than the hymns, louder than the prayers, louder than the demands of centuries of unbending tradition. And then it happened. In the flickering candlelight at the foot of the altar, Luca's gaze fell upon the simple white coffin of Pope Francis. It was not the grand papal tiara or jeweled crozier that adorned it, but a single hand-carved wooden cross, plain, unadorned, humble, just like the man he had guarded. Something within Luca's chest cracked, a fracture deep and irreversible. Without conscious thought, his hand moved. The polished steel pike he had held upright for hours trembled, and then slowly, deliberately, Luca lowered it. The tip descended toward the marble floor, in a silent salute of mourning, the rigid line of discipline broken by the quiet bow of grief. A gasp rippled across the basilica, faint at first, then growing, like the rising murmur of an unseen wind. Heads lifted, eyes widened, whispers darted like sparrows through the pews. As if in a trance, Luca reached up and removed his helmet, cradling it in one arm. His bare head, crowned only with his own humanity, bowed low in direct, open mourning. Beneath the vaulted ceilings where popes had been crowned and kingdoms consecrated, a single Swiss guard had lowered himself in love, not duty, In a world built upon centuries of rigid symbolism, this was not a minor breach. This was a rupture. Across the sea of black robes, cardinals turned to one another, exchanging sharp glances. Some murmured urgently behind raised hands. The heads of state shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to interpret the gesture as a scandal or a revelation. The senior officer of the Swiss Guard, standing near the nave, stiffened visibly, his hand twitching toward his ceremonial sword before he thought better of it. Somewhere among the pews, an elderly nun clutched her rosary tighter, her lips parting in a silent prayer, not for the Pope, but for the young man who had dared to love too openly. Luca remained perfectly still, helmet at his side, his head bowed so deeply that his chin nearly touched his chest. His heart thundered against his ribs. He had been trained to stand firm through anything, heat, pain, exhaustion, sorrow, but no training had prepared him for the storm of raw humanity that now battered at him from within. A part of him, deep and terrified, screamed at him to lift the pike, don the helmet, restore the perfect image of loyalty demanded by centuries of discipline. But the larger part, the part shaped by his grandfather's gentle faith and Pope Francis's teachings of humility and compassion, knew it was already too late, and more importantly, that it was right. High above, the stained glass windows caught the shifting light of the morning sun, scattering fractured rainbows across Luca's bowed figure. In that moment, he looked less like a soldier and more like a penitent saint, standing small and bareheaded in a sea of rigid ceremony. The contradictions of the moment hung heavy in the air, the beauty of discipline clashing with the beauty of grief, the coldness of tradition shivering before the warmth of love. No voice rose to command him. No hand dragged him back into line. Time itself seemed to stretch, each second an eternity of judgment, as the ancient rituals of the Vatican collided headlong with the living heart of a single man. For the first time in perhaps 5 centuries, the silent wall of Swiss guards did not hold unbroken at a papal funeral, and the world was watching. The cardinal, officiating the blessing, hesitated for half a breath, his voice faltering ever so slightly before continuing the final prayers. The great bells of St. Peter's tolled overhead, their mournful peals echoing through the basilica like the heartbeat of a world in mourning, and now, perhaps, in awe. Luca did not lift his head when the prayers ended. He remained bowed even as the funeral procession began to move, the coffin carried slowly toward its final resting place. Only when the last mourners had passed did he slowly, reverently rise, replace his helmet, and lift his pike back into position. But the break had been made. The silence had been shattered, and somewhere deep within the Vatican's ancient walls, something had shifted, something that would not easily be undone. The ceremony ended as solemnly as it had begun, but beneath the surface of the Vatican's polished rituals, a tremor had begun. As the final hymns faded into silence and the grand doors of St. Peter's swung open to release the procession, a quiet signal passed through the Swiss Guards' ranks, one not visible to the untrained eye, but understood instantly by every soldier present. Corporal Luca Bernardi remained standing at his post, helmet restored, pike steady, the picture of outward composure. But the breach had been made, and tradition did not forget so easily. 2 fellow guards approached him silently. There was no need for words. One touched his elbow gently, a gesture that in another context might have been mistaken for camaraderie, but here bore the unmistakable weight of an order. Without resistance, Luca lowered his pike and stepped back from formation, his polished boots moving softly across the marble floor. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his head high, his steps slow and measured. If he was to be cast out, he would go with the same dignity that had shaped his life, not as a man broken by shame, but as one tempered by conviction. The crowds, still murmuring in low, respectful tones, barely noticed as he was escorted away. But within the inner sanctum of Vatican hierarchy, the ripples of his act spread swiftly. Beneath the frescoed ceilings and behind carved oak doors, whispers were already taking shape. Fragments of shock, dismay, outrage, breaking centuries of sacred funeral discipline. Some called it unforgivable. Others feared it was a symbol of something deeper, a crack in the Vatican's perfect mirror, revealing the frailty beneath its rituals. Through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of the Apostolic Palace, Luca was led back toward the guards' private quarters. No hand gripped him roughly, no voice barked orders. The silence was punishment enough. The footsteps of his companions echoed against the stone walls like quiet drums of judgment. As he passed beneath the solemn gaze of ancient paintings, saints and martyrs who had suffered for their faith, Luca wondered not for the first time whether the rules he had broken were meant to honor the soul or merely protect the ceremony. Inside the plain stone barracks, away from the eyes of the world, Luca stood at attention before the commandant of the Swiss Guard, a man he had respected like a second father. The commandant said nothing at first, simply regarding Luca for a long, heavy moment. There was no anger in his gaze, only a tired sadness, as if mourning not just a soldier's fall, but the unbearable weight of choosing between tradition and heart. "You understand?" the commandant said quietly at last, his voice stripped of ceremony, "that the consequences for your actions will not be light." "I do, sir," Luca replied, the words steady on his tongue, though his stomach twisted into knots. He had imagined this moment many times in the hours since the incident. Dismissal seemed inevitable, perhaps even formal censure. His grandfather's St. Christopher medal pressed against his chest beneath the stiff fabric of his uniform, a silent anchor against the tide of uncertainty rising inside him. The commandant studied him a moment longer, then nodded slightly. "Wait in your quarters. You will be summoned." Dismissed without a salute, without ceremony, Luca turned and marched away. Each step echoed too loudly in the narrow halls, a painful contrast to the silent honor he had once moved with. Inside his small room he closed the heavy wooden door and stood there for a long time, still in full dress, unable to remove the uniform that had once been the outward expression of his deepest vows. He sat finally at the edge of his narrow bed, his hands resting on his knees. Around him, the sparse furnishings of his life as a guard seemed to close in. The simple desk where he had written letters home, the bookshelf lined with histories of the papacy, the small framed photograph of him shaking Pope Francis's hand after a security detail 3 years earlier, all artifacts of a life built on discipline, loyalty, and silence. And now, perhaps, a life that had ended with a single, undeniable act of humanity. The crowds, still murmuring in low, respectful tones, barely noticed as he was escorted away. But within the inner sanctum of Vatican hierarchy, the ripples of his act spread swiftly. Beneath the frescoed ceilings and behind carved oak doors, whispers were already taking shape. Fragments of shock, dismay, outrage, breaking centuries of sacred funeral discipline. Some called it unforgivable. Others feared it was a symbol of something deeper, a crack in the Vatican's perfect mirror, revealing the frailty beneath its rituals. Through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of the Apostolic Palace, Luca was led back toward the guards' private quarters. No hand gripped him roughly, no voice barked orders. The silence was punishment enough. The footsteps of his companions echoed against the stone walls like quiet drums of judgment. As he passed beneath the solemn gaze of ancient paintings, saints and martyrs who had suffered for their faith, Luca wondered not for the first time whether the rules he had broken were meant to honor the soul or merely protect the ceremony. Inside the plain stone barracks, away from the eyes of the world, Luca stood at attention before the commandant of the Swiss Guard, a man he had respected like a second father. The commandant said nothing at first, simply regarding Luca for a long, heavy moment. There was no anger in his gaze, only a tired sadness, as if mourning not just a soldier's fall, but the unbearable weight of choosing between tradition and heart. "You understand?" the commandant said quietly at last, his voice stripped of ceremony, "that the consequences for your actions will not be light." "I do, sir," Luca replied, the words steady on his tongue, though his stomach twisted into knots. He had imagined this moment many times in the hours since the incident. Dismissal seemed inevitable, perhaps even formal censure. His grandfather's St. Christopher medal pressed against his chest beneath the stiff fabric of his uniform, a silent anchor against the tide of uncertainty rising inside him. The commandant studied him a moment longer, then nodded slightly. "Wait in your quarters. You will be summoned." Dismissed without a salute, without ceremony, Luca turned and marched away. Each step echoed too loudly in the narrow halls, a painful contrast to the silent honor he had once moved with. Inside his small room he closed the heavy wooden door and stood there for a long time, still in full dress, unable to remove the uniform that had once been the outward expression of his deepest vows. He sat finally at the edge of his narrow bed, his hands resting on his knees. Around him, the sparse furnishings of his life as a guard seemed to close in. The simple desk where he had written letters home, the bookshelf lined with histories of the papacy, the small framed photograph of him shaking Pope Francis's hand after a security detail 3 years earlier, all artifacts of a life built on discipline, loyalty, and silence. And now, perhaps, a life that had ended with a single, undeniable act of humanity. Outside his window, the bells of St. Peter's tolled again, lower now, slower, as if mourning something deeper than a pope, mourning the inevitable passing of all things that could no longer hold against the tides of change. Luca knew he should feel regret for breaking the code, for embarrassing the guard, for staining a tradition older than most nations. But sitting there alone, his heart heavy and yet strangely at peace, he found he could summon no shame. Only the memory of his grandfather's voice, quiet and steady, whispering from the recesses of childhood. True loyalty isn't blind. It knows when to bow to something greater than orders. Whatever consequences awaited him, disgrace, dismissal, exile, they would not unmake the choice he had made. Luca Bernardi had stood for once, not as a statue in a uniform, but as a man, and no decree, however ancient, could strip him of that truth. For a day and a night the Vatican seethed quietly behind its marble walls. Whispers moved like invisible tides between corridors, across stone courtyards, through the high, frescoed halls where few outside eyes could follow. Within the barracks of the Swiss Guard, Corporal Luca Bernardi remained confined to his quarters, the uncertainty of his fate pressing against his chest, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. His superiors met behind closed doors, their faces grim, their decisions not yet spoken aloud. The old codes were clear. Discipline must be absolute. Any break, no matter how pure the intent, was to be dealt with swiftly and firmly. Yet somewhere beyond the reach of those ancient protocols, something else stirred. A ripple that began not among the guardsmen, nor among the Cardinals, but in the private archives of the Vatican itself. In a quiet office overlooking the gardens, The Cardinal Secretary of State unfolded a letter written in the unmistakable hand of Pope Francis, dated exactly 7 days before his passing. The ink was faded slightly where the Pope's frail hand had trembled, but the words were clear, steady, unflinching. "Let them not be statues," the Pope had written, "but sons mourning a father. If any among the guard should forget their discipline in favor of compassion during my funeral, let them not be punished. Let them be honored, for love that dares to show itself is truer than duty that hides." The Cardinal Secretary read the letter once, then again, a slow, dawning understanding softening the hard lines of his face. The Pope, in his final days, had seen what so many had missed, the danger of turning loyalty into stone, of confusing ritual with love. And he had laid down his last wish, quietly, humbly, with the trust that it would be honored when the time came. The next morning, the press was summoned to the Vatican briefing room, a rare occurrence so soon after a papal funeral. Journalists crowded in, their voices hushed, cameras flashing sporadically beneath the vaulted ceilings. Whispers of the incident at the funeral had already begun to leak into the public, fueled by shaky smartphone videos and grainy photographs capturing the lone Swiss guard, bareheaded and bowed, in a sea of unbroken formality. Standing before the gathered press, the Cardinal Secretary adjusted his glasses, unfolded the letter carefully, and began to read. In his final week of life, His Holiness Pope Francis left instructions regarding the funeral rites. The Cardinal began, his voice reverberating in the expectant silence. In particular, he spoke of the Swiss Guard, those young men who had stood vigil over his life and would stand sentinel over his death. A murmur moved through the crowd, the journalists leaning forward, pens poised, cameras focusing sharper. Should any among them break their sacred discipline to show grief, the Cardinal continued, his voice deepening, they are not to be punished, but honored. A stunned silence fell over the room. "Let them not be statues, but sons mourning a father," the Cardinal quoted, his voice thick with emotion. "Let them be forgiven their humanity, for it is humanity that the Church must serve above all else." The words seemed to hang in the air like a benediction, pressing against the hearts of everyone present. For a moment, even the clicking of camera shutters paused, as if the old stone walls themselves absorbed the Pope's last lesson. In his small, sparse room, Luca sat on the edge of his bed, his head bowed, unaware of the shockwave unfolding beyond his door. It was only when a soft knock sounded and the door creaked open that he looked up to find a fellow guardsman standing there, not with condemnation, but with a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You're wanted upstairs," the young man said quietly. "It's not what you think." Confused, Luca rose, smoothing his uniform automatically, his muscles moving out of habit more than will. He followed the corridor up into the bright light of the antechamber where the senior officers and chaplains gathered, their faces somber but somehow gentler now. The commandant himself stepped forward, a folded document in hand. Wordlessly, he offered it to Luca. As he read the familiar scrawl of Pope Francis's handwriting, his hands trembled, not from fear now, but from something deeper. A weight lifting, a wound being seen. The commandant cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Corporal Luca Bernardi," he said formally, yet with unmistakable pride threading his words, "by direct instruction of His Holiness you are not reprimanded. You are to be recognized for having the courage to feel what others dared not." The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was reverent, the kind of silence that honored not just rules but the heart that beat behind them. Somewhere high above, as if stirred by something unseen, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring again, Not mourning bells this time, but the steady, clear chime of life moving forward, carrying with it not just the memory of a pope, but the spirit of a church that had, if only for a moment, remembered how to weep without shame. The sun hung low over the manicured lawns of the Vatican gardens, casting long golden shadows across the ancient stone paths. It was here, in a private ceremony attended only by the Swiss Guard and a handful of senior clergy, that Corporal Luca Bernardi stood once more in full uniform, his heart pounding, not with fear now, but with something softer, almost sacred. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and freshly turned earth, a quiet reminder that even the most hallowed traditions must find ways to grow. Before him stood the Cardinal Secretary, his crimson robes stirring slightly in the warm breeze. In his hands, resting on a velvet cushion, was Luca's helmet, polished to a gleam, the symbol of a duty that had been tested and found stronger, not weaker, for having bent. The Cardinal stepped forward, his weathered face marked by the kind of solemnity reserved for moments that stitched history together in silence rather than spectacle. With steady hands, he lifted the helmet and placed it carefully into Luca's arms, his voice carrying gently across the quiet garden. "You served not only with loyalty," he said, "but with love, and that is the highest service of all." Luca bowed his head, the helmet cradled against his chest, the weight of it somehow lighter than it had ever been before. Around him, his fellow guardsmen stood at attention, not in judgment, but in silent respect. For in the weeks that followed the funeral, something had shifted within the guard's ancient walls, something that could not be undone. Later that day, in the barracks, where centuries of history lived and breathed through stone and steel, a new plaque was installed beside the names of fallen heroes. It bore no grand titles, no list of battles or campaigns, only a simple inscription, carved deep into the marble for all who passed to see, in memory of those who loved, even when forbidden. And beneath it, without ceremony, a single name had been added, Corporal Luca Bernardi. In the quiet of the evening, as the last light faded over the eternal city, Luca stood before the plaque, his helmet tucked beneath his arm, and smiled, not with pride, but with peace. He had not broken his oath. He had fulfilled it. In a world obsessed with rules, where ceremony is often mistaken for meaning and silence for strength, sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is to break the rules for love. Sometimes true honor is not found in standing still, but in bowing, freely, openly, without shame, when the heart demands it. Corporal Luca Bernardi reminded a world draped in mourning that even the strongest traditions must sometimes make room for tenderness, and in doing so he taught us that real service is not blind obedience, but love, chosen freely, even when it costs everything. Have you ever stood for something bigger than the rules? Have you ever chosen heart over habit, truth over tradition? Tell us your story in the comments below, and if this journey moved you, stay with us for more real stories where honor shines brighter than ceremony, and love rises stronger than law.